Dr. Sherry Fox is a forensic anthropologist, bioarchaeologist, paleopathologist, wears a number of different hats, having received her master's degree and PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona. She's held positions at the American School of Athens and the International Committee of the Red Cross Forensics Unit, and currently serves as an assistant teaching professor at Arizona State University in the School of Interdisciplinary Forensics. She has excavated all around Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, including, of course, Cyprus, where she's headed different projects. She's here today to discuss something really unfamiliar to me, which is forensics and bioarchaeology. Sherry, thank you for accepting my invitation, and welcome to the History of Cyprus podcast.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I'm very pleased to be speaking with you today.
How long were you in Cyprus for?
I have lived in Cyprus off and on. The longest period was about 2 years, but I've worked on, I think it's about 15 different projects in Cyprus, from the pre-pottery Neolithic B until modern times.
Wow.
So yeah, so I've had a lot of experience in Cyprus, and I consider Cyprus a second home. I've had some kind of interesting jobs. I worked for Physicians for Human Rights on the Cyprus Missing Persons Project. I had worked most recently until it was late July of last year. I was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross as a forensic coordinator or forensic specialist in a number of contexts around the world. So, yeah. So, and then, I ran the Wiener Laboratory for about 15 years in Athens.
Yeah, so I think forensics and bioarchaeology, it sounds all very appealing, but admittedly, I'm not entirely too sure what bioarchaeology is and how it differs from traditional archaeology. So do you mind just explaining to listeners what the differences are?
Excellent question. Bioarchaeology is the study of human remains in archaeological context. So basically, we are interested in who created the culture, who is behind the material culture that archaeologists are studying, who made the pots, who built the who designed the buildings, this sort of thing. So we're interested in the human remains from archaeological contexts, and it's more than just the bones. It's the burial itself, the burials themselves. So how were individuals buried? What were they buried with? Who were they buried with? That sort of thing. What were the funerary rituals?
And what sort of information can you gather from studying skeletal remains exactly? Like, for example, diseases?
Yes, absolutely. Diseases, individual age, the sex of the individual. You can reconstruct living stature. You can look at trauma in the human skeleton, individuating characteristics such as osseous anomalies. We look at the dentition. Often dentition are preserved, teeth are preserved in the archaeological record. So all sorts of things that we can assess from studying human skeletal remains and human remains. We have mummified remains in archaeology too.
So what sort of tools are you using, or what sort of tools are at your disposal for kind of, piecing together these puzzles?
Most of what I do is pretty much low tech, but we do use microscopes. I'm often using a stereo microscope. We use X-ray quite regularly. But then once we have assessed, because it doesn't make sense to do more in-depth studies or scientific examination of human remains without knowing what it is that you're dealing with. You don't just, do ancient DNA on bones. You need to know what the question is and who do these bones represent. So yeah, we do things like we'll do tests including ancient DNA, as I just mentioned, but stable isotope analysis for dietary reconstruction, as well as population mobility. You know, lots of different tests that we can do. Look at the oral microbiome. We can look at trace element analysis. Sometimes we're interested in, for example, heavy, you know, lead poisoning, that sort of thing in antiquity. So lots of different things that we can do.
You wrote that, and I quote here, skeletal material was considered useless and fine art objects overshadowed any anthropological research, end quote. So when did this like shift happen? I mean, is bioarchaeology a relatively new field? And what
Well,
kind of brought it out?
yeah, I would say it is, Andres. Jane Dykstra coined the term bioarchaeology in 1977. She's still teaching at Arizona State University. So it's not that old of a of a term, although people have been practicing bioarchaeology for some time. As far as studying human remains, I mean, I think people have been doing this for quite a long time, but it depends. In Cyprus, for example, the prehistoric material is always saved and always studied. But once you get to the more historic periods, there was a general kind of understanding that we know who these people are. We don't need to save the human remains. So that, I would say, is a more recent development. I mean, more my lifetime, in my lifetime. So, you know, a lot of, I think, what I do and my colleagues do is educating about what it is that you can learn from studying the human remains, but they need to first be saved. So the earlier material, the material from the pre-pottery Neolithic B, the material from, you know, that's Cassandra Maluthkia that I'm mentioning, that the late Eddie Peltenberg had excavated, the material from Kirkatia that Dikeas and Alan Lebrun have studied. That material is saved and studied. So it's the later periods that haven't received the attention until more recent years.
And you mentioned to me that you've excavated from pre-pottery Neolithic.
I have excavated at a number of sites in Cyprus, but that material had been excavated and then I studied it from some wells. The earliest wells that I think are known are from Kassandra Maluthkia. And the one individual that I studied from, it was a cranium and mandible and a first cervical vertebra that were recovered from one of the wells. The individual was head-shaped. So, or what we say cultural cranial modification, a form of body modification, probably what we would call cradle boarding, another term for cradle boarding. But Cyprus has all kinds of head shaping going on, or cultural cranial modification going on, different forms.
I'm vaguely familiar with the practice having existed in Cyprus at some period, but you know, when I came across, I can't remember which paper I read, but it was just so bizarre to think of Cyprus or ancient Cyprus using cranial modification. It was just a really surprising thing.
It's very interesting, and you see it around the world at different times. And even today, we're modifying babies' heads. We like round heads, and so we put them in helmets sometimes, if you've seen. I think with sudden infant death syndrome, you've got a lot of babies that have flat heads because they're told to put the babies on their backs, and the mattresses are firm. And so you get today a similar type of head shaping as what you may have seen at Kirkatia or at Cassandra Maluthkia with this occipital flattening. But when I was first looking into this, and I should mention that Kiersey Lawrence from the Cyprus Institute has done more research on this head shaping. I'll say it's easier to say than cultural cranial modification, Kiersey's done more work in this area than anyone else. And it is just fascinating. When I was looking at material from Kirkatia, for example, I had thought in reading what J. Lawrence Angel had published in the 1953 very important work that was done at Kirkatia in Dikios's volume entitled Kirkatia. I thought, oh, these are just busy farmers. They're putting their babies in cradles, hanging them from the tree as they're harvesting. They're busy farmers, and then when I started looking at the material, it's definitely intentional. It's not just a byproduct of busy parents. This was intentional. The head shaping that had been taking place at Kirkatia. And I have worked in northern Iraq and Erbil from the Ubaid Chalcolithic period to this Ubaid culture, where you've got head shaping. It's a different form of head shaping. We see at least one individual at late Bronze Age Enkami with a similar type, this Ubaid type. It's got two bands of circumferential kind of banding that was done, not the occipital flattening. It's hard to describe, but at any rate, there were different types of head shaping, that I've seen in Cyprus at late Bronze Age. Kalavassos Iosdemetrios, I've seen it looks more like a cone head. I don't know how else to describe, but different types of head shaping at different times. And why was this important? This is nothing that the individual himself or herself decided, yes, I want to be head shaped. This is something parents decided, and it was done in infancy when the cranial bones are not yet fused and the brain is growing. It's fairly easy to do.
Is this something, because I mean, you mentioned you found it in Iraq, elsewhere in the Middle East, presumably.
Yeah.
Would you
say in the New World? We see it in the New World as well.
100%. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, would you say for Cyprus this was a local innovation, or do you think
We've got it from the pre-pottery Neolithic B. It probably, at least from Kasanarga Maluthia, may have come from the mainland. And I think, again, the Ubaid shape that I have been trying to describe, not very well, that we have seen an individual from Enkami with this head shaping variety, probably came from the mainland, but there may have been local innovation as well in this. And I think the best example, and I'm going to borrow from Joanne Clark. She was talking about Neolithic pottery. This was years ago in Cyprus, and she likened it to Scottish tartans, a way of identifying yourself. It's a way of saying, this is me. This is us. We are we are part of this group, perhaps. And it's very interesting. Would you head shape your sons and your daughters? Would you head shape only your daughters? Are they leaving and you need to show that they belong to your group? It's all very interesting. And there's much more that needs to be learned. But the movement of people, and were societies patrilocal or matrilocal, it's all very interesting how it may have been related. So
was there ever a connection made between cranial modification in Cyprus and the type of burial associated with that particular person?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we do see in Egypt, it's definitely, for example, something that that royalty propagated. They head shaped. The royal families in Egypt were head shaping their children. So yeah, it can reflect socioeconomic status. It can. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that we do a sort of cranial modification even now, and
Yeah.
I have kids, and we were concerned at one point that my son, his head, the back of his head was getting flat, so we purchased a specific type of pillow to kind of
Hmm.
shape it so it wouldn't
Yeah.
flatten at the
Yeah.
back. You mentioned the helmets. My niece wore one of those helmets.
Yeah,
She-
absolutely. We're still modifying.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
didn't even think of it in those terms. It's so
That there
funny.
you go. Yeah. And you wonder, because when I had looked at some of the occipital regions, the back of the head of some of the individuals from Kirkatia, you can actually see a concavity. How this wasn't just a flattening, but how were they achieving this flattening? There are different ways, and I've seen different reconstructions. And interestingly, one of the reconstructions I've seen from the Ubaid period, where they had the binding underneath the chin, and I'm thinking that just wouldn't work. Babies are nursing, they move their mandibles, their lower jaw is moving when they're drinking.
Mhm.
And so you wouldn't be untying and tying and untying. It was at the back of the head. But it's interesting to see how some of these, how they were achieved, but it really doesn't take that much. And for very long, it's early infancy. And it doesn't affect brain growth usually if you're not, really constricting. There's no problem with the brain. Okay.
Yeah. I want to jump back just a little bit here because we were talking about the Chalcolithic, and I want to go back to the Neolithic period, specifically Kirokitia. Can we infer ritual symbolism? Were there any grave goods deposited? Causes of death? Can you speak to that period in time?
Yes, they were buried intramurally within the house, within the round houses, under the floors, and in a semi-flex position on their sides. The individuals were buried, sometimes with a stone by the head. There were other objects, I believe, buried with the individuals. So yes, there was definitely ritual. This was the practice that was carried out. Because of the way the individuals were buried at Kirkatia, their preservation is among the best on the island, from what I have been able to see. Bone likes a very, and I'm jumping ahead here, but a very neutral pH, soil pH. Um, and how individuals were buried at Kirkatia. You visited the site. It's built on a slope next to a river, and you can see that or a stream, but you can see that the water would run off the hill and not soak in. And because there were roofs on these huts or these round houses, the human remains were protected for quite some time. And because the water wouldn't get trapped, it was running off. The preservation is very good, which is not generally the case in Cyprus. We tend to have fairly
Right.
poor preservation of human skeletal remains. Now, the soil pH, I've tested at a number of sites, and the limestones that predominate, at least along the south coast, are very basic. They're alkaline soils. Alkaline soils are not great for bone preservation. They are, however, pretty good for DNA, preservation of DNA, which is one good thing. We do have some terra rossas, and where the potatoes are grown in the southeast part of the island, very acidic soils, again, poor for bone preservation. Bone tends to like very stable environments. So you think of Egypt with hot and dry conditions, or the Russian tundra with, cold and cold conditions. Bone tends to like stable environments. And what we have in Cyprus, we've got very hot, dry summers and very cool, wet winters. And if water gets trapped at all, say the individual was recovered from a sarcophagus and the lid was broken and water got in, that sarcophagus fills up like a bathtub. And if at all, you get freezing temperatures, it's just very detrimental to bone preservation. So where you've got good preservation, and I've seen from the cistern at the early Christian Calvasos Copetra, you've got really nice preservation, and right next to it, not very great preservation. So yeah, mostly the preservation is fairly poor on the island. I would say fair. You can still, determine quite a lot, but it's the alternating conditions of hot, dry, and cool and wet that are detrimental to the preservation.
Speaking of what in this period, what is the sort of typical cause of death? I mean, can we glean anything about the quality of life in the Neolithic period?
Well, I think farming has its own. I think I think people are very surprised. My students are often surprised when they learn that hunter-gatherers are often healthier than farmers. Yeah, and it's for a number of reasons. When you have a sedentary lifestyle, you are dependent upon, you've got, a water supply that can be contaminated. You've got to worry about sewage. And you also, when you're farming, you're not getting the variety in your diet. So you tend to be reliant upon grains, and then you can have nutritional deficiencies as well, vitamin deficiencies, that sort of thing. So in general, hunter-gatherers tend to do better than the early farmers. But lifespan, what do we see? As a trained forensically, we are looking often at trauma for cause of death. And we don't often see cause of death in the archaeological record, because what kills people kills them quickly. What we see in bone can make them miserable for a long time, but isn't often the cause of death. Infection can kill people. We will see, for example, a lot of osteoarthritis in the archaeological record, right? But our osteoarthritis is not usually killing people. That's not usually the cause of death, right?
So we learn more
Excuse me.
about the quality of life that they lived, and diseases or other things that they suffered through, as opposed to
Yes,
what they died from.
because what you see in bone usually develops over time. Not all the time. I mean, and I'm talking about disease processes, not trauma. Trauma happens usually quite quickly, but disease processes develop rather slowly, can develop rather slowly.
I was
Yeah.
really surprised to learn to read about parasitology, which I understand is a huge, I don't know if it's a new field, but to study essentially parasites, which arise by nature of living with animals, with animal husbandry and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Very
Yes.
interesting related field. And I have been fortunate to work with some archaeoparasitologists. And I can relate. I will say personally, I've not had great experience or great results, I should say, in getting any results from archaeoparasitology. Submitted lots of soil samples, but haven't found the eggs of these parasites that we're looking for, the intestinal parasites. They are looking oftentimes at, for example, people studying coprolites are looking at fecal remains, looking at feces that are preserved archaeologically for diet and disease, and latrines. Again, this is not individual results, but you can get individual results if you can take soil. Say you've got a supine burial, an individual buried in an extended position on their backs, which is quite usual for a number of time periods in Cyprus, for example. If you take soil from the area of the pelvis, right above the sacrum, for example, you can sometimes get good results. I just haven't been fortunate enough to get good results, but the results you can get have to do with what kind of animals were being eaten. Were these wild animals? Were they domesticated? I know one of the results that was obtained by Dr. Pierce Mitchell at Acre in the Eastern Mediterranean from the Ottoman period. This was a Crusader latrine. They found a parasite that's only found in fish from the Baltic, some fish that lives in the Baltic. Now, does that mean the Crusader came from that region of Europe, or was the fish sold and transported to, the area of Acre, and somebody got then the parasite from the fish that had traveled? I'm not certain, but it can tell you whether sometimes the parasites are only found in uncooked meat, for example. You wouldn't find the parasite in cooked meat. All kinds of things that you can learn from archaeoparasitology. So it's a very interesting field, and I know people have attempted it in Cyprus. I don't recall any published results, but I haven't been lucky with it working at a site.
Yeah. Now, is that for Cyprus? Is that because of the climate that we talked about earlier?
It may be. It may be because of the soil conditions. Yeah.
Now, I believe one thing that we can glean from human remains is thalassemia.
What you see with in the skeleton from thalassemia, for example, you could also see as a result of iron deficiency anemia, perhaps. You may see it as a result of parasites in the gut that are causing, a lack of absorption of nutrients. So you have to be careful with the interpretation, and it really requires genetic study, looking at ancient DNA to determine if you've got one of the 100 variants of thalassemia. The most common is beta thalassemia in the Mediterranean, and you've got sickle cell anemia in Africa, you've got alpha thalassemia in Southeast Asia, and all of these regions of the world have developed these deleterious genes have been perpetuated because of a malarial environment. So it's something called a balanced polymorphism, where who survives to reproductive age? If you've got both genes for thalassemia, you're going to probably die from thalassemia. If you have both normal genes, you're probably going to die from malaria. So carriers of the genes tend not to get malaria, and they don't die from thalassemia. So they live to reproduce. And when two carriers reproduce, on average, half of their children will be carriers. A quarter will develop thalassemia. A quarter may die from malaria. So it's a very interesting thing that has, and Cyprus has the highest incidence of alpha thalassemia outside of Southeast Asia. They've got sickle cell too that they have had. But again, with no malaria, this should be dropping off, okay? There's no need to perpetuate this gene in natural selection. So it's very interesting. But what do you see? You see a thickened cranial vault. You see where red blood cells are manufactured in the diploe of the cranial vault, the in-between layer between the outer cortex and the inner cortex. It'll thicken. And the outer cortex, especially in the area of the frontal, will actually just become really rarefied. And you get in X-ray, and looking at a lateral X-ray, you get something called a hair on end pattern. And so it's recognizable, and thalassemia shows up in this way. You'll see, where red blood cells are manufactured, you'll see a thickening in the skeleton. And Analaya and colleagues, I think she did this study with Kostas Eliopoulos and Sotiris Manolis. It was published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology some years ago, an individual from the Modern Comparative Collection in Athens, an individual that died from thalassemia. And it's a really important study to see what, you can see what the skeleton looks like, both macroscopically and radiologically.
You mentioned that osteoarthritis was something that you came across in a lot of
Yes.
the remains. Is that,
Yes.
I suppose, two questions here. Is that typical of ancient Cypriots? And also, how is that determined? Is that something that is simply done with an X-ray, or are there any other tools that you use in order to make those conclusions?
Interestingly, you can get osteoarthritis as just a degenerative type of thing that happens over use. You can get it from trauma. So when people say, oh, he must be old because he's got osteoarthritis, no, you don't say that. You have to take a look at what's going on. And do you see it throughout the skeleton, only on one side, that sort of thing. But when you see this bone on bone polishing of bone, if you see a real shiny, it's called eburnation on the joint surfaces, you've got osteoarthritis. And I've seen people try to say, because you've got eburnation in the hips of cows, that this is evidence of plowing. And I think it's kind of a ridiculous thing if you oversimplify what's going on. Because I had in my collection in Athens, I shouldn't say but the collection at the Wiener Laboratory in Athens at the American School of Classical Studies, a cow that came from East Tennessee, and there was very much eburnation in one of the hips, but not the other. And it was a traumatic, something traumatic happened with this cow that caused the destruction of the joint, causing this bone on bone polishing.
With the osteoarthritis, is that something that would have generally been associated with older populace? I mean, is that exclusively
It
found
can be,
among...
but again, it can be just from use, from wear and tear on the joints. So if you're working hard and you've been working hard your whole life, you're going to see it earlier, right? So and you can be old and not have osteoarthritis. So yeah, generally we see more of it in older individuals because they've had more time to accumulate the damage.
So an individual living in Cyprus, I don't know, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, it's short, it's harsh, it's brutish. Would that be a fair assessment?
I don't know. I think I would rather live in Cyprus than some other places, to be honest. But is there food
Yeah.
supply?
Yeah.
Yes. Are we seeing evidence of, growth arrest lines in the bones? They're called Harris lines that you can see macroscopically if the bone is broken.
And that's from
But
a
you can
lack of
see,
nutrition.
yes, it's usually from, but we see the growth interruption lines in the dentition too, enamel hypoplasias. They're usually lines, horizontal lines on the teeth that you can see when growth has been interrupted. Now, a number of things can interrupt growth, like fever. So if you've got malaria as a little kid, you might have growth arrest lines. If you have a nutritional deficiency, you're not getting enough food, growth may be interrupted because teeth tend to grow even when long bones don't. So oftentimes in antiquity, when you're looking at human remains, the dental age looks greater than the skeletal age. I would always go with the dental age rather than the skeletal age. And when times are aplenty, people tend to be taller. They reach, the statures that They could in life because they haven't been ill and they can attain those statures. They haven't had an impediment based on, lack of nutrition, that sort of thing. So yeah, we do see evidence of, enamel hypoplasias. We see things like high infant mortality in some places. We see a lack of stature, short statures, that sort of thing. But think about Otzi, because I'm thinking about the time you're talking about. Otzi, was he typical? I don't know. But this is Chalcolithic, right? He was about 5'2", 5'3". He wasn't tall. Most ancient Cypriots were not tall. Did he have other things going on? He had all kinds of things going on. We've learned more about this one individual from the Chalcolithic than almost probably anybody else from antiquity, But yeah, I think I would prefer to live in Cyprus than any other places, I think.
Yeah, fair point.
If you've got a water supply,
Fair point.
when you get into times of drought and that, yeah, you're going to be talking about with climate change, things are going to be more difficult. Yeah.
You mentioned that teeth can be very revealing, especially about age.
Teeth for age, very important. And again, I mentioned that teeth, they're often preserved in the archaeological record because they're the toughest. Enamel is the toughest part of the human skeleton. The teeth are often what remains. And you look in the fossil record and, paleontology, yeah, we're often looking at teeth. So what else can we tell about teeth aside from age with children, at least through dental eruption and development, but looking at dental wear, what were people eating? I have a colleague that studies Neanderthal diet from looking at dental wear. And, it's quite complex the way she's assessing it. But at the same time, when you're looking at, again, we were talking about farming. If you've got a stone mill that you're grinding your grain with, you're going to get some of that stone in your meal, right? In the flour, and it will wear your teeth down more rapidly than if you were a hunter-gatherer, for example. So we look at dental wear, and again, you've got people smoking with clay pipes, and you can see, I don't know if you've ever seen before, but when you approximate articulate the jaws, the maxilla and the mandible, you can sometimes see holes where the teeth have worn away to the outline of that clay pipe. Because people were holding the pipes in the same place in their mouths. People use their teeth as tools in basket making, in tanning hides, that sort of thing. And then teeth themselves can relay something about population affinity, something about family, genetics. I will give you an anecdotal situation. I am congenitally missing a tooth. My children have that tooth, but my niece is missing the same tooth that I'm missing. So sometimes you can relay family information, genetic information with, say, something like a missing tooth or an extra tooth, a supernumerary tooth. All kinds of things from studying teeth. You can learn all kinds of things.
That's really cool. The fact that you can determine someone's occupation simply by looking at their teeth.
From looking at their teeth, yeah.
If we fast forward a couple centuries, there is a change in burial practices. I think of the Cypro-archaic or later on into the Roman period. What are some of the changes in the way bodies are deposited? What sort of differences
we do see quite a change, and actually that change has Well, it's in many places been kind of perpetuated, but we see secondary burial and multiple secondary burials. So if you have say a primary burial, someone dies and you inter them, you bury that individual. And then, at least in modern Cyprus and modern Greece, usually it's 5 to 7 years or so after that, there's a secondary burial that takes place where the individual is exhumed, well, or uncovered, and another rite is performed by the priest, and the family is there. Those remains then get moved to the side of the tomb, or they can be removed from the tomb and placed into a charnel house. And if you think of, say, Mount Athos, if you've ever seen the human remains from Mount Athos, they've got the crania all together and the femora all together, piled up, stacked up at Mount Athos. Now, I'm a woman, I've never been there, but I've seen photographs from Mount Athos to see this practice of removing the bones from the primary burial and placing them either in another building or underground in another area or within the same tomb to the side. I don't know if that makes any sense. I have worked on...
No, it does.
It does it. I've worked, for example, on material from Greece that it was what was left of a primary burial site. So you've got mostly finger bones, toe bones, some ribs, but not the long bones, not the crania, not the mandible, but you get the little bones, especially of the hands and the feet, and of multiple individuals. So the same tomb was used, and then those bones were removed, and what was left behind were the little bones that they missed. So what we get is that we do find some primary burials, but oftentimes we see large tombs that are rock cut, and then you've got different chambers going on, quite elaborate burial customs, and multiple interments, and lots of grave goods. You know, just it's showing things about the, you know, I mean, we can infer things about the culture, trade, wealth, all kinds of different things.
Cremation
So,
was practiced in this time as well.
yes, we do have cremation. We have cremation from at least the late Bronze Age, Mycenaean practice in Cyprus, I believe. But definitely into the Iron Age, Roman period, we've got cremation. It's never the norm in Cyprus, as cremation can be elsewhere. But again, it can be a status thing. Yeah, it can show influence from the mainland, from Greece, for example, from Italy later on, where, for example, cremation can be the rule. But interestingly, in Cyprus, you know, the customs today involve secondary burial. In Greece, they involve secondary burial. In Athens, you can rent tombs for the decomposition process, because the belief is that the soul resides with the flesh. And it's a good thing to not have, for the human remains, not to have any flesh on them. Then they just become the bones of our ancestors, and they can get moved into an osteotheke, into a charnel house. They can get moved within family tombs to the side to make room for a new family member.
Would we say this was the standard in the period?
Yeah, I would think it's the standard in the period from, I mean, we do see some multiple interments in the Chalcolithic, but by the Iron Age, I would say, yeah, we are moving into a lot more complex burial customs. and secondary burial.
Now, you worked in Bafos, and I read in one of
Yeah,
your papers that the mean age of death, I don't recall exactly the period, it might have been the Roman period,
yeah.
was 34 to 35 years. And it just occurred to me, and I wanted to ask this question earlier, and I'll ask it now. I was always surprised by the short lifespan, and I always wondered, is the mean skewed because of high infant mortality, or is there something else that explains for why there's such a short lifespan in these periods?
It's an excellent question. I think we have evidence, at least from the Roman period, of individuals being able to achieve quite old age. I think there's an individual from the gladiator cemetery at Ephesus, for example, that the grave marker says he lived to be 99 years old. Now that's quite an old age for a gladiator. But yes, if you've got high infant mortality, what we're often looking at is just adult age. For females, there's oftentimes there may be a greater risk during and after pregnancy. Infection following pregnancy was probably fairly common in antiquity. Infection is still killing people in hospitals today and in the world today. Disease, we just had a pandemic. We had plagues in antiquity as well. So, all kinds of things going on that can shorten the lifespan. Yeah, but in general, today we're seeing women living longer. In antiquity, we usually say you see men living longer. So lots of different, but that's a generalization.
Yeah. In your work, is it easy to distinguish between, I mean, apart from the fact that you can determine where the individuals lived, whether it was urban or rural, but I'm more curious as to, do you see any characteristics between these two populations to say, for example, that a rural inhabitant may have been more healthy or unhealthy? Is it revealing in any way?
I think so. I think we've seen patterns. Again, I've got small sample sizes in Cyprus. So when you're looking at South Coast early Christian human remains from Alisa Ayamavri, from Moroni Petrera, from Kalvasos Kopetra, when you're comparing these rural South Coast areas to an urban settlement in Nicosia at the hill of Ios Yorios, for example, we've got different patterns going on with trauma. And we've got more, I would say, more severe trauma along the South Coast. So falls, we've got people fracturing from falls, and some of these fractures aren't even healing. But what do we see in the more urban settlement? Inland and urban, hand trauma, cranial trauma, more perhaps interpersonal violence going on in an urban setting than in the rural setting. So you've got people living with animals. You've got diseases that are spread from animals to humans. It can go the other way too. Animals can get sick from us as well. But if you've looked at the structure of homes, people were living with their animals. You look at Roman Curion, for example, you've got the animals are on the ground floor and people are living, the families are living above the animals. So diseases that are spread from animals to humans in Cyprus, even until relatively recent times, diseases like brucellosis, diseases like echinococosis, the hydatid cyst disease. Yeah, they were a problem for Cypriots into the modern era, well into the modern era. And the government got involved with centralizing slaughterhouses to try to reduce the disease and eradicating, getting rid of stray dogs, that sort of thing. So brucellosis, the most common variant in Cyprus, is something called melitensis. It's spread by goats to humans. And who do we see today? I've met veterinarians in Cyprus with brucellosis. It's mostly men. Children don't um, tend to contract brucellosis, but and it's not because there's a sex predilection for the disease, it's because men have the jobs that are handling the goats. They're the veterinarians, they're the butchers. They tend to be the shepherds or the goat herders. So again, I think Alan Hersher and I published in the report of the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus years and years ago from a Middle Bronze Age tomb in the Paphos district. I think the site is Masoi, an individual that we suspect may have had brucellosis. There's a large defect on a lumbar vertebra. And I took it to be radiographed in Nicosia, and the radiologist said, oh, brucellosis. It's at least a possibility. And interestingly enough, from this Bronze Age tomb was a milking bowl, what they call a milk bowl, right? And so again, we're talking about how are people contracting the disease? Domesticated animals, they may be consuming goat's milk. I know in Greece, I had friends that have contracted brucellosis. You don't see it today in Cyprus. It's not common, but it's still in the endemic in parts of the world.
I just wanted to ask you, is there anything that comes to mind that really stands out in your work in Cyprus? Any particular cases that you would share with listeners?
I guess the cistern in Cyprus, I find from Kalvassos Kopetra, and I mentioned it earlier, it was very surprising to me because here you've got this, what is probably a monastic complex from the early Christian period, or you could call it late Roman or early Byzantine, but you know, it probably came to an end around the mid 7th century. And you've got a basilica that was built of gypsum slabs. You've got a church nearby that has opus sectile floors, these marble inlaid floors, and then you've got another church, and they're all within a stone's throw from each other. Another church that has mosaic floors, and associated with this basilica is a cistern that it's kind of, I think they say bell-shaped. It looks like an Erlenmeyer flask to me. And it was a hard hat area. I wasn't allowed to go in, but I would look at the material on my day off that was coming up elsewhere from the site, and there are all these individuals coming up from the cistern, human remains from the cistern. And I thought, well, were they just cleaning out some tombs and somebody had a nice hole in the ground and they thought, okay, we'll just dump these bones in this nice hole. Well, I was able to go into the cistern and I could see articulated remains. These were individuals that were deposited into the cistern, probably thrown into the cistern, not dry bones that were deposited into the cistern. And what would account for these remains of, I think it was 9 individuals. It's been some time since I've looked at that publication, but of different ages, you know, adults and children and infants. And what was going on? Why would you just destroy your water supply? You know, this holding supply. It had to be something pretty catastrophic. Have I seen any trauma on the human remains? No. But when you're looking at, you know, again, who is represented? You've got all ages in this. I think you have males and a male, 2 males and a female, if I'm not mistaken. Again, it's been some time since I've looked at the publication, but a range of ages. Maybe it was a plague, and it's something that you know, I'm hoping to follow up on. I've actually found somebody to do the work to see, is this like among the more common plagues from that time period? Justinian, plague of Justinian, for example. But I've got to get the export permit and the money together to undertake the work. But it's fascinating to me, and I was surprised to see, you know, folks thrown into a cistern.
Yeah, that is the only thing that. Why destroy your water though? Like that's
Why
the one
destroy
thing
your
that
water? Now,
I don't
again,
understand
we've
that.
got, you know, raids coming in, marauders coming in at this time period. It's a fairly tumultuous time period. What was going on? But again, I haven't found any trauma on the bones. I haven't found cut marks on the bones, that
Yeah,
sort of thing. Okay.
yeah,
So why would you destroy it? It obviously now the settlement in Calabasas is now more inland, closer to the mountains, right? At the, you know, the Neolithic site of Tenta, the early or the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age site of Calabasas Demetrios, and the early Christian site at Calabasas Copetra are all very near the main highway going from Limassol to Larnaca and then Nicosia. And it's very close to the highway, whereas the village today is more inland. So it could have been a sign of abandonment of that, you know, monastic complex as well. We've got all kinds of things going on, you know, uh,
yeah.
between earthquakes like that destroyed Kurion, and you know, there are all kinds of things that took place in antiquity.
Now that you mentioned our early Christian period, what sort of changes do we see now? I mean, I recall reading that, you know, we see evidence of wooden coffins, for example.
Yeah, exactly. We had at Copetra there were nails found. Okay, and these aren't shoe nails; these are like coffin nails within the what they were calling a crypt. And interestingly, they were they thought they had an ossuary um, associated, these two tombs, large tombs, kind of outside, just adjacent, associated with the basilica at Copetra. And they had to excavate hurriedly the one, and they thought it was an ossuary. And interestingly and importantly, the archaeologist, even though they were excavating in a hurried manner, had subdivided the this tomb into quadrants. And I was studying the remains. I had excavated it at Copetra, but not that season. It was the first season when they uncovered this, what they thought was an ossuary, and with commingled human remains. And when I was reconstructing what I was finding, I was only finding upper body parts in the north end of the tomb and only lower body parts of representing 4 adults in the south end of the tomb. And from one of the photographs that had remained, I could see this was not an ossuary. These were interments of primary burials and a multiple interment. And we could see from the other tomb that it was opened and closed at different times. So it wasn't like 4 people died at the same time. Probably they died and they were placed in, died and placed in, died and placed in. But interestingly, from that time period, you know, it's like, oh, we know who these individuals are. And there are all these, you know, quote unquote rules about who's buried where, and especially in association with churches or basilicas. No apse burials. Well, we've got apse burials at Moroni Petrera, for example. We've no children buried in association with a church, and we do at Calabasas Copetra. A number of these different things. All burials are east-west with the head west, but we've got north-south burials as well. So it's not, I think what I wanted to say is that there's more variety. It's not as rigid as we may have been told. There is variety in burial practice. And as you mentioned, the coffins, we have evidence of coffins being used. We've got sarcophagi being used at for example, Palavassos Copetra. There were sarcophagi being used. We've got pit burials. We've got multiple interment burials. We've got secondary burial. There's a lot going on.
Right.
So I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of variety going on. It's not, and it's very useful to study these individuals, to study disease. I'm very interested in disease in antiquity. And when I was working on my dissertation research, I thought maybe I'm missing something. I haven't seen leprosy. I haven't seen syphilis. I haven't seen TB. Am I missing something? I went and to Bradford University with the Calvin Wells collection, and I looked through. I want to see leprosy. Now, I've seen leprosy in Greece. I hadn't seen leprosy in Cyprus. I've seen people with leprosy in Cyprus years ago.
Really? I'm surprised to
Yes,
hear that.
yes, there had been a leprosarium in Aglanja, and it was moved to Larnaca. And I was lost, and I was near the Salt Lake, and I saw a UN vehicle, and I think a lot of people on the island didn't know about it. I can't imagine that there's anyone still left. These were old people 35 years ago, So I can't believe that there would be anybody left. But the story goes that they moved the church from Aglanja, stone by stone, to Larnaca. And there were people with leprosy living there, right adjacent to the Salt Lake in Larnaca, near the old airport.
Now, to say that you didn't find evidence of it in the sort of bioarchaeological record, that doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It's just
Absolutely.
it goes back to that whole thing about the climate, the Cypriot climate, that's just not really conducive to preserving.
Yeah, absence of evidence is not evidence for absence, right? So,
right.
yeah, it doesn't mean, you're absolutely correct in stating that. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. We know that it existed in antiquity. It doesn't just appear from out of nowhere, right? But I didn't see it in the material I was studying. I have seen it, as I said, like leprosy, for example, in Greece in antiquity, but I haven't seen it in Cyprus.
When human remains are found in Canada, the United States, there are ethical considerations in mind that we have to include the Indigenous communities in every step of the excavation process, and for a lack of a better word, because I can't think of the word right now, the reinterment process. It's not simply a matter of scientific study. There's a lot of Indigenous considerations that we need in North America. I'm curious, are there any such ethical considerations or hurdles when dealing with tombs, remains with the Orthodox Church and in any particular period, specifically dealing with more like Christian periods?
It's an excellent question, and ethics, of course, comes into play everywhere in the world. And you mentioned North America, particularly Canada and the US, but there are other countries, Australia, for example, Israel. There are, definite ethical considerations when working on human remains around the world, and various laws in place. I personally have never had any issues with the Orthodox Church. It's an excellent question, but again, I think the beliefs that the soul is attached to the flesh, and once the flesh is gone, the individual is no longer. Those are the bones of the ancestors. They are not. It's not Uncle Yannis any longer. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. I remember going to the Gurion Museum recently, and I think it's there where they have the remains of earthquake victims.
Yes, I worked on those. Yeah, I think, I worked on that family.
Oh,
They
wow,
were,
like directly with
yeah,
that family. So I
yeah.
interviewed Laura Swantek, who I
Uh-huh.
believe is in charge of the site, and we had a conversation about that. But please, if there's anything that comes to mind about that you'd like to share, please do. But
Yeah.
anyway, I just looking at them being on display, incredibly fascinating. But there's a part of me, I'm like, I
Yeah.
wonder if there's any, considerations, if there's any naysayers out there that are saying that this
Well, it's
isn't
interesting
right,
in that many places in the world you would not put human remains on display. Okay. But
Right.
it's acceptable in Greece, it's acceptable in Cyprus. And the story that's, that this family generates, it's quite moving. There's a National Geographic article that came out in, I think it was 1988, and on the family from Kurion. And in 365 AD, and David Soren can tell you the date in July that Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about this gigantic earthquake that hit the Eastern Mediterranean with tsunami, etc. And this is probably the earthquake that destroyed Kurion. And there was a family that was in bed. A man is cradling a woman, and the woman is cradling an infant. And the bones of the family, it's always like the last day of the excavation. I wasn't there, but my advisor was there. In 1986, the family was uncovered, and they had to stay later than intended because they found an individual, then they found another individual, and then they found the remains of the baby. And the man, interestingly enough, was wearing a ring with a Cairo on it. And I know the local priest came to give burial rites because these individuals died catastrophically in this earthquake, and they didn't have a funeral. So he came to give, kind of last rites to this family.
Now
That
that
was
is
probably a
incredibly
Christian family,
yeah.
in the early Roman period, or the late Roman period, excuse me.
The
And
fact that the priest came to administer a
yeah,
service is
yeah,
something that this is the first I'm hearing of this. This is incredible.
yeah, very moving. And yeah, it was a, very, it's a different kind of thing working on an earthquake site when you don't know what you're going to find, than working in a cemetery, for example. And I believe that the late Vassos Kariorgis was the one that said, he was visiting the site and said, this needs to be block lifted. It needs to be displayed. He had the vision that this family, it was very important and it needed to be displayed. So yeah, and I worked on the museum display. We actually got sick working with acetone to try to clean the bones, but yeah,
Oh no.
yeah, it was very interesting, and it's nice to go and visit the family at the Episcopi Museum. So I'm
I'm
glad you got to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really, I mean, I had my family there, had kids,
Mhm.
we had quite a conversation around it. But I'm sure listeners are wondering, what do archaeologists do with the remains that are excavated and studied? Are they simply returned, or are they brought to another building for storage and further study? How does that work in Cyprus?
It's a very good question. And in Cyprus, the remains are saved. I know I have done battle in the past, long in the past, with this isn't a cemetery, it's a museum. But the remains are saved in museums. They're submitted. Usually you're working in a storeroom oftentimes of a local museum, that then once the study has been completed and the excavation has ended, all the materials are submitted to usually the district museums in Cyprus, and some things go to the National Museum in Nicosia. But they're saved because there may be a new test that a new scientific study that can be developed in the future where we can learn yet more about these individuals. And again, it's not science if you can't repeat the study. So you've got to save this material. These are the individuals that created the culture. That's how we started with this with this talk. So
Right,
yeah,
right.
so they're saved. In
It just
Cyprus, that's the situation. I know in some places, indigenous, you were talking about Canada. Indigenous peoples in Canada may have control of the human remains from their tribes, and so it's very interesting how different countries deal with human remains, and it varies from place to place.
Yeah, for listeners and I hope I'm not mistaken here, but I believe they contact the nearest present indigenous community or nation that takes ownership over the remains, like you mentioned. They might not necessarily have been part of that nation, but
Exactly, but
yeah,
they may be the most, in today's world, the nearest neighbor. Yeah.
it's just so all of this to me is what you do is really cool. It really
It's
is. I mean,
very interesting. And, even working like my work, doing humanitarian forensics during the pandemic, it was very critical to understand burial customs. And and I remember talking to someone that I worked with when I was living in Thailand. Why are you so worried? And I said, people aren't going to be able to have the funerals that they're used to having. They're not going to be able to wash the body. They're not going to be able to put coins in the mouth or rice in the mouth or whatever it is. They're not going to be able to do this. And interestingly enough, it may not be a part of the religious doctrine, but it's what people are practicing, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm an anthropologist. That's what I'm interested in. So it's, again, even today, burial customs play a huge part. It played a huge part in my work when I was working in Asia, for example, during the pandemic. So.
Sherry, I want to just thank you again for coming
Sure.
onto the show, and this was all awesome. And I just want to thank you again.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I'm a very visual person, so you can't see me, but I'm talking with my hands. Anyway, but
Um,
I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
I hope you have a great afternoon, and yeah, we'll
You
be in touch.
too.
Thanks again, Sherry.
Okay, all the
Take care.
best. Take care,
Bye.
Andrea.